mankind has no natural predator. Rather, humanity must routinely face a plethora of diseases that seek to bring about its annihilation. So unused to such predation, in history plagues have often been heralded as the end times, and surprisingly, not always during the midst of illness. On occasion, some people have foreseen the coming of disease long before the first victim. Some plagues, both past and present, are said to have been predicted. In the age of monarchy, to predict the death of a king usually foreshadowed your own demise. Yet, in a rare example dating to 1649, William Lilly, a 17th century astrologer, predicted the death of King Charles I and survived. For 11 days after he did so, the monarch's divinely anointed head was severed from his body. Thereafter, Lilly became a highly respected seer. Lilly, however, was in no rush to be overly zealous in the practice of his art. In the times in which he lived, one could find capital punishment easily served to those who dabbled in occult practices. 3 years later, he risked his personal safety once more, compelled to share a vision he had regarding London's future. Ever cautious, Lilly published his prophecies as hieroglyphs, a visual code of sorts which would ensure that his visions were concealed from the vulgar and made manifest only unto the wise. In 1665, a great plague ravished the city of London. This catastrophe was followed by a great fire which burned down much of the city in 1666. 2 of Lilly's hieroglyphs, published in the 1650s, depicted these exact events happening. On the 25th of October 1666, he was summoned before Parliament, suspected of having started the Great Fire of London. The parliamentary committee made no secret as to why Lilly had been summoned. They were highly concerned by his long since printed book, in which he had hinted at the fire and the sickness. One of the hieroglyphs depicted what appeared to be many bodies wrapped in burial linens. The other displayed a city on a river in flames. Lilly denied any wrongdoing and adamantly asserted that his hieroglyphs merely depicted what he had interpreted from his astrological observations. Speaking before the assembled parliament, he described how he had framed these 2 hieroglyphics after having found that the city of London should be sadly afflicted with a great plague, and not long after with an exorbitant fire. Now, years later, his predictions had been proved very true. As to the cause of the fire, far from being his doing, Lilly stated that he had taken much pains searching for the cause. He concluded, he explained, that it had been the finger of God. The Great Plague, too, was regarded as a natural disaster. We now know it to have been an instance of bubonic plague, which is estimated to have taken the lives of over 100,000 people. Such a high mortality rate can be said to be illustrated by Lilly's prediction, the image of which shows workers digging many graves to keep up with demand. Lilly defended himself eloquently in Parliament and was acquitted of the charges. Despite having denied predicting a date for these catastrophes, some believe that Lilly's prophecies were even more precise than first appears. It is said that within his hieroglyphs he concealed a date for the events yet to happen. Particularly, it is said that in the illustration of the twins hanging over the fire, there are astrological clues as to the date of these 2 events. As his arraignment before Parliament made clear, Lilly had to tread carefully with his astrology. Not everyone appreciated his art. The end times, as many would have seen the pestilence and the subsequent fire at the time, for most were better off unseen. John of Ashenden was a 14th century Oxford scholar and astrologer. Fascinated by the study of celestial objects for the purpose of divination, He wrote a series of academic tracts on the subject in the late 1330s and early 1340s. His predictions were written in a highly academic fashion, and it is clear that they were not meant to attract a popular audience. Rather, they were written to be discussed amongst his fellow practitioners. Through his studies, he interpreted a conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter with a lunar eclipse in 1345 as a sign of impending catastrophe. He claimed that this year would inaugurate a time of chaos, conflict, and worryingly great mortality. In 1345, reports of a terrible, highly contagious, and often fatal sickness from around the Volga River in Russia began to circulate. That same year, the intensity of the 100 Years' War, a series of conflicts between England and France, which started 8 years previous, increased, with heavy defeats being inflicted on the French. Seemingly just as the astrologer had predicted, Europe was entering a period of conflict, chaos, and great mortality. It was in 1346 that the now legendary Battle of Crécy inflicted a disastrous defeat upon French forces. By the end of the year, as conflict reigned, so did disease. The sickness from the east had arrived in Europe. It was in 1347 that Ashenden's predictions started to have their most awful implications. From 1347 to 1351, bubonic plague decimated the populace, with up to 60% of Europe's population being annihilated by the disease by the time it ebbed away. The first symptoms were flu-like, fever, headaches, and vomiting. Before too long, swollen and painful nodes formed on the skin. Often, death would soon follow. Unable to keep up with the mortality rate, mass graves were commonly used. A contemporary Florentine chronicler described how citizens did little else except to carry dead bodies to be buried. Those who succumbed to the illness were bundled up quickly and thrown into deep pits. Rather disturbingly, the chronicler described the process of layering bodies and earth as being similar to how one makes lasagna with layers of pasta and cheese. By the time of its conclusion, the Great Pestilence was one of the most devastating plagues in human history and would be forever remembered as the Black Death. In the midst of the plague in 1349, Ashenden wrote another tract, which described how the pestilence would soon start to subside. Dry celestial forces, the astrologer claimed, would counter the cold, wet influences of the disease. Oddly, he was proven right, with the sickness beginning to subside in the 1350s. Ashenden's predictions, although eerie, can be ascribed to coincidence. Arguably, his timings are imprecise, with the Black Death not truly ravaging Europe until a few years after his initial prediction of 1345. Yet, this can be said to depend upon interpretation. Ashenden did warn that 1345 would inaugurate the start of a terrible time of suffering, and that, in a general sense, was indeed true. Did John of Ashenden foresee one of the worst mass spread of diseases in human history? Take handfuls of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss it into the air in the presence of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on men and animals throughout the land. The biblical plagues are one of the most dramatic episodes of the Old Testament. They describe a series of plagues that ravaged Egypt, a consequence of the Pharaoh's disobedience when he did not do God's will as foretold to Moses. Exodus, the book of the Bible in which the plagues are described, claims that Moses had prior knowledge of the terrible plagues before they happened. He predicted their coming. Shocking indeed, but did they, and indeed Moses' prophecy, actually happen? Most scholars do not regard the Bible's book of Exodus as a historical account. However, there are some who do believe that it does describe true events and can even be corroborated by the Egyptians themselves. The Ipuwer papyrus, written sometime in the 2nd millennium BC, speaks of a time of great chaos in Egypt. Some scholars identify certain passages as being very similar to the Bible's Exodus. One such passage in the papyrus stated that the river is blood, which is arguably similar to the Bible's description of how all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. The ancient source also stated that he who puts his brother in the ground is everywhere, telling of how many men succumbed to the Great Plague. Once again, this has been argued to be similar to the biblical pestilence. In Exodus, it is said that God commanded that every firstborn son in Egypt will die. Both the papyrus and the Bible describe the sickness as swift and deadly, just as Moses supposedly foretold. Due to the descriptive similarities between the papyrus and Exodus, the debate continues as to whether or not the biblical plagues were real events, documented in both sources. Some have identified differences between the two. Yet, for every argument there is a counter, making this one of the most hotly debated issues in biblical scholarship. Whatever the truth may be regarding Exodus, according to the papyrus, a great pestilence did afflict Egypt. A pestilence which may very well have been foreseen by a real-life Moses figure. "1918 was a harrowing year. The Great War was at an end, but for many the suffering was only just beginning. This year, a great sickness would show mankind that despite its greatest efforts to destroy itself, nature would always do it better. Spanish influenza swept across the world and eliminated as many as 100 million people. It would take both the global wars of the 20th century combined to match such a number. At the beginning of the century, the possibility of such troubles were far from people's minds. In fact, the great progress of the 19th century seemed to herald the coming of a golden age. Le Figaro, a prominent French newspaper, captured the gleeful zeitgeist when it exclaimed in the year 1900, "How fortunate we are to be living on this first day of the 20th century." Yet, in that same year, a far less optimistic soul published a different sort of outlook. A book titled The Predicted Plague detailed many aspects of astrology which forecast doom for the 20th century. Referencing an Eastern prophecy, the book claimed that early in the 20th century, Great Britain and the chief cities of Europe will be revisited by the Black Death plague. Whilst the exact nature of the disease which touched the lives of many in the early 20th century was not the same as the Black Death, it was a comparably horrific plague. Highly infectious, the virus caused flu symptoms, including fever, nausea, and diarrhea. Many of the infected went on to develop severe pneumonia. As the end approached, they would turn blue before suffocating as their lungs filled with a frothy, bloody substance. Whilst it may be easy to dismiss a book which references vague Chinese astrologers as its source, it is difficult to entirely dismiss the predicted plague. After all, the book is remarkable for having been published many years before Spanish flu, at a time when utopia seemed within humanity's grasp, and plagues were distant misfortunes from a bygone era. In 2008, an alleged psychic called Sylvia Brown published a book called End of Days. In it, she predicted that in around 2020, a severe pneumonia-like illness will spread throughout the globe, attacking the lungs and the bronchial tubes, and resisting all known treatments. On the 31st of December 2019, a new strain of a highly infectious virus was discovered in China. In the new year, cases of the sickness were reported across the world. The disease attacks the respiratory system, and currently there is no known cure. For those who knew of Brown's prophecy, the spread of the virus in 2020 seems to confirm her 2008 prediction. Skeptics have, however, criticized her prediction as merely being coincidental, with one commentator stating that even a broken clock gives the right hour of the day twice. Others have pointed to past predictions Brown has made which turned out to be incorrect, such as a cure for Parkinson's disease being found. Brown, however, is not alone. There have been fears of another influenza severely affecting humanity for years. In 2017, when the outgoing director of the United States Center for Disease Control was interviewed by the Washington Post, he was asked about his biggest concern. He responded by saying that it is always for an influenza outbreak. In 2019, a plethora of experts seemed to confirm his fears when they came out warning of an oncoming global sickness. The epidemiologist Dr. Larry Brilliant, in September 2019, declared with absolute certainty whilst on CNN that there will be a mass outbreak of disease. Whilst he did not specify a date, with the world now facing such a threat, his timing is ominous to say the least. Indeed, the World Health Organization sounded a warning bell in its 2019 annual report for global preparedness when it stated flatly the world is not prepared for a fast-moving, virulent respiratory pathogen. Why does it seem that so many people so accurately predicted the current virus in the years leading up to its appearance? Those who are conspiracy-minded have cited such reports as evidence that this disease has clandestine roots. However, it could equally be argued that influenza preparedness should always be on the agenda for governments and agencies. That said, it is easy to see how the timing and the seemingly particular emphasis given to deadly respiratory illnesses in 2019 is disconcerting. Brown's prophecy, combined with recent warnings from scientists, are undoubtedly eerie. As it stands, only time will tell as to just how deadly this new virus will be. Does this new decade face a new pestilence, much like the one faced and seemingly predicted around 100 years ago? Or will the illness be dealt with as efficiently as other strains of influenza have been in recent memory? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe if you have not done so already. Also, be sure to enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon and check you have enabled YouTube notifications on your device. Only then will you be notified whenever I upload new content, and surely you wouldn't want to miss my next video. Until then, why not go ahead and check out another video suggested on the screen now. Until next time.